Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Where today, we are going to have a look at another regiment of the Imperial Guard. Or, well, the official military title might be a bit misplaced here, as today's regiment in question is a Penal Legion regiment, the Savlar Chem-Dogs. A very colourful addition to the ranks of the Imperial Guard. But first, a word from our lovely sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, the foremost dungeon exploring and fighting strategy game available for both PC and mobile devices, with hundreds of magical artifacts and a bevy of over 600 champions, with which you will have to take on the countless challenges awaiting you in Raid. You can use the link in the description or the QR code on screen to join now. And today, we are going to talk about the High Elf faction. They came into being thousands of years ago, and quickly set about creating their own little kingdom, built on the decidedly elven virtues of unflinching and pompous self-absorbance. They even found some lesser factions, like the humans, more than willing to pet their rapidly inflating egos in return for a collection of magical and philosophical teachings. Which incidentally did turn out to be a pinch flawed here and there, as their creators, the High Elves, eventually descended into a bloody civil war. Granted, there was an evil god involved in all of that, so extenuating circumstances and so on and so forth. And after all the havoc and mayhem had finally passed, the High Elves are now busily rebuilding their much-reduced nation and reputation. Whilst we're on the topic of elves as well, Raid just released a brand new faction to the game, the Sylvan Watchers, woodland elves with spirits and treants and druids and all manners of magical woodland creatures to further enhance your dungeon clearing roster. There is also a brand new season of the Forge Pass, with a ton of new rewards, and if you are an Amazon Prime customer, there are yet further rewards to be had. Meanwhile, for all new players, if you join now via a link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen, you get a free $30 starter pack, the free champion ironer, and an assortment of welcoming goods. So join now and you will find all of these rewards here in your inbox. Now then, the Savlar Chem-Dogs hail, unsurprisingly so, from the world of Savlar. Or, well, most of them do anyways. Being a penal world, there is always the possibility of a few foreigners being included in their ranks as well. But the majority of the fighters within the Savlar Chem-Dogs have been born and raised on the Imperial penal colony that Savlar has become, which in reality is only a slight step down from what it once was. A mining world, and a mining world of the worst sort as well, as Savlar is not a primary planet, but rather a massive moon in the Savlar system. And the only reason why the Imperium has even bothered with this particular chunk of shit floating aimlessly through space is due to the enormous chemical riches that could be found deep beneath its surface. Volatile chemical riches. Therefore, even during the days of being just a mining colony, mortality rates amongst the work crews was so high that death was more of a promise rather than a possibility. Yet, despite the production difficulties imposed upon the world by the fragility of its fuel, Savlar became a very productive and important cornerstone world in the Segmentum Solar, particularly in the area around the world of Armageddon. But as Savlar's importance kept rising, so did the demands for ever greater quantities of precious chemicals, and with it, the casualty rates climbed as well. Until finally, the world's already de facto indentured servant population were not able to keep up with quota requirements, and Savlar was turned from a mining world into a penal world to ensure that the flow of chemicals remained constant. Now, one could argue that, if anything, this should actually decrease the quota throughput, as you are pumping in thousands of very unmotivated and completely uneducated labourers whose, by and large, only life experience was one of violent crime. But if you pump in enough of violent criminals and enough violent overseers to make sure that they are directing their abundant energies in the correct direction, then, as things turns out, you can maintain the quota. And this time, the drastic rise in casualties is not a problem, it's a boon, because the Imperium has way too many criminals as it is already. But there are still some few itsy-bitsy tinsy-wincy drawbacks of, well, a solid population of hardened criminals. For example, the fact that the very reason why they end up on Savlar tends to be their propensity towards violence, fraud, civil disobedience, and general unruliness, really. Leading, of course, inevitably to a situation where it was no longer just the chemicals on Savlar that were volatile. And so, with the same unavoidability as the chemical fumes that cover the planet, prison rebellions became a common and frequent occurrence. The sizable Adeptus Arbites garrison, of course, was more than able to take care of these disturbances, whilst also making sure to maintain high production quotas. But it did get awfully annoying after a while, to the point where they got into a little bit of a catch-22 situation, where if they sent in more workers in the form of more criminals, then the prison uprisings would in turn become more frequent, meaning that they would have to shoot more workers, which would in turn require more fresh criminals to be pumped into the system, which would in turn produce fresh uprisings. Bit of a vicious circle, as you can quite clearly see. It was then that Judge Callister, the overseer of Savlar, came up with a brilliant solution to bleed off the population's more determined elements on a frequent basis by conscripting them in to Imperial Guard Penal Legions, which became known as the Savlar Chem-Dogs. Now, in normal circumstances, going into an already decidedly unstable population and attempting to recruit them into the military by force would lead to further disturbances. But luckily, the extraordinarily inhospitable nature of Savlar meant that most of the more determined and healthy elements would actually happily volunteer for military service as a preferable and healthier alternative. It's almost to the point where you start to feel bad for them. But, of course, they couldn't be trusted entirely, and so there were a few rules put down before the first of the Chem-Dog regiments could be formed. 1. They would have no native officers whatsoever. They would all be levied from the ranks of the Schola Progenium, and there would be a lot of commissars attached to every regiment. For obvious reasons. These commissars and officers would of course have the right to execute anyone they saw fit, or levy upon them the worst punishment any native of Savlar could ever possibly imagine. To be sent home. No, actually, the fate worse than death is to be sent back to the planet from whence they came. But It wasn't all bad news, for alongside the heavy-handed punishment also came a promise that the officers and the commissars would develop temporary and highly selective cases of blindness when it came to looting. For whilst of course service in the God Emperor's most holy name is reward enough in and of itself, the ex-felons of Savlar argued quite determinedly that they would be far better suited to serve in his glorious name if they were able to personally augment their equipment and personal finances with anything and everything the enemy and occasionally friendly regiments failed to adequately guard in their presence. This does place a bit of an extra strain on the logistical systems of anyone serving alongside them, but it is usually a transitory problem, as the Chem-Dogs tend to be shunted off to the more inhospitable parts of any battle zone they are involved in, far, far away from any friendlies, where they, to be fair, do tend to perform relatively well too, especially considering the state of most Savlar Chem-Dog regiments. Here's the thing. Your average Imperial Guard regiment is going to have a fair bit of training before it is actually levied. It's going to go through boot camp, it's going to be told how to handle weapons, how to operate alongside Imperial armor, artillery support, how to take orders from officers, how to fight effectively in formations, how to fight as a part of a larger troop, how to receive supporting fire from heavy weaponry, how to fight alongside heavy bolters, plasma weapons, mortars, yada 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 yada, and the countless other specialist arms of the Imperial Guard. It takes a long time to create even an adequate modern soldier, and a lot longer to create an actually good one. But the Savlar Chem-Dog regiments function on much the same assumption as their old world did. Namely, that if one person can't figure out how to operate the hyper-complex chemical extraction machinery, then after his scorched and half-melting corpse has been shoved out of the seat, the second guy will have an opportunity to do better. And whilst, of course, natural selection in the face of enemy heavy machine guns do tend to see attrition march along at a brisk pace, frankly, just like back home, nobody actually cares. Even the Chem-Dogs themselves take at best an interest in their own personal survival, and maybe a handful of, comrades is not really the correct word here, co-conspirators, or, accomplices. Yes, that's the one. And as for the rest of the regiment, or the formation that they are in, if a bunch of them dies, then there'll be a lot more loot for everybody else now, won't there? But this instinct is also kept in check a little bit by the simple fact that if everybody else dies, then the last man standing is sure to join them very, very swiftly. Meaning that the Savlar Chem-Dogs find themselves in a very interesting little balancing act, where everybody wants to get all of the good loot for themselves, but they also want to be able to, survive the battle. And those two objectives are often mutually exclusive, especially as the Imperial Guard and other commanders tend to assign the Chem-Dogs to, again, the more hostile parts of the battlefield, where there really is no choice but to work together or die together. A fine motivational force, that. This has actually led to quite a few Savlar Chem-Dog regiments becoming quite good at what they're doing, and even halfway valued by other Imperial Guard commanders, despite still making sure that they don't land anywhere near their regiment, of course. Though, I imagine that for every actually effective Chem-Dog regiment, there are another 7 that died in their very first battle, either due to enemy action or due to their unique nature. And it certainly does require a bit of a special touch to get the most out of the Savlar Chem-Dogs. Some touches they've developed on their own, and some touches have been enforced upon them. For example, one of the little improvements that the Savlar Chem-Dogs have made themselves, and in part where they get their name from, is their specially modified rebreather masks. Now, on Savlar, a mask is not optional. If you go outside without one, that is the last time you're going to be leaving your hab. And so, most of them wear their rebreathers as, well, almost a reflexive thing. It has become a part of them at this point, and to be stripped of it would be like going out naked. But the modifications are of a slightly more adventurous nature than merely making sure that the air around them is safe to breathe, as many have also worked in various chemical injector systems into their rebreather masks, allowing them to administer various adventurous cocktails in the midst of battle. The most common of them all is a concoction that gives a little bit of extra backbone to the fresh recruits, to make sure that they don't suddenly re-evaluate their decision to leave Savlar behind when faced with a 2-meter-tall orc, or a bloodthirster, or a horde of screaming Eldar banshees, etc. But I am also sure that the far more veteran elements of the Chem-Dogs will undoubtedly have far more tailor-made concoctions to make them better at close quarters fighting, to calm them down regardless of the situation, to steady their hands in a firefight, or alternatively, straight up gas. Of the lethal variety. Maybe a nice big lungful of fresh Savlar air, for example, just in case they're fighting something that tends to like taking captives, and make sure that they value every memory of their homeworld, no matter how awful. But it isn't just the liquid courage that makes the Chem-Dogs an effective regiment either. Bear you in mind, the people that are going to be signing up for the Chem-Dogs are either those who are so desperate and convinced that they will never survive another day on Savlar, and will do anything to get away with it, and seeing as, if they commit another crime, like, say, fleeing in the face of the enemy, they get sent back, they're going to be very motivated. And the other type that join up for the Chem-Dogs are those who are very, very confident in their ability to kill pretty much anything placed ahead of them. Psychotic murderers aplenty, in other words. They're the kind of people who probably thrive quite well on a battlefield with a nice and loose set of rules of engagement. And generally speaking, if the Chem-Dogs are being put in, the ROE is going to be rather permissive. And so the regiment makes up for their lack of discipline and, well, leadership, guidance, tactics, strategy, and in many cases, effective weaponry, with good old-fashioned ferocity and, well, insanity. But that's just the beginning. The really scary prospect is of a Chem-Dog regiment that actually manages to survive a war zone or two. Because you remember I mentioned the commanding officers take a very permissive view of extracurricular requisitory actions taken by their soldiers. Meaning that whilst the regiment initially is rather poorly equipped because, well, the Munitorium isn't going to throw good equipment after a goddamn Penal Legion, now is it? If they're very lucky, they're going to get their last rifles and a flak jacket, with the latter having to be shared between an entire platoon. But this state of arms and armament poverty rarely lasts beyond their initial deployment. as any chem-dog with any ambitions of surviving his first firefight is going to immediately prioritize acquiring some fresh and upgraded gear for himself. And usually in any war zone, there is going to be plenty of Adeptus Munitorum equipment just lying around, with practically no one but a few overseers and automated sentry guns watching over it. They're practically begging for you to steal it. This in turn means that, depending upon the level of entrepreneurship that can be found within the regiment in question, Chem-Dogs can actually be amongst the better equipped Imperial Guard regiments, especially on an individual footing. For whilst many of their somewhat more stiffer, rule-abiding brethren have all kinds of regulations stating what they can and can't bring into the field, you only get so and so many power packs, you only get one lasgun, you certainly don't get a sidearm, and if you misplace your shovel, well, the commissar will just have to shoot you. But the Chem-Dogs have no such worries. You want to carry 5 dozen power packs? Go ahead. You might need to steal a backpack to carry them all, though. 6 shovels? Why not? Might as well make a flak jacket out of it at this point. Extra rebreathers, extra socks, extra boots, extra armor. Whatever you want, so long as you can acquire it. And in the Chem-Dogs' defense here, considering they know for pretty much absolute certain that they are going to get the shitty end of any stick they are handed, they might as well make sure that they are at least equipped with a set of nice heavy gloves to take it with. And sometimes, even the shitty deployment can be a real gem in the rough. Sometimes, even the Chem-Dogs get lucky. For example, the 14th Savlar Chem-Dogs Regiment deployed during Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka's second great temper tantrum on Armageddon. That war saw several of the mighty hive cities of the planet fall to the Orc invader, and even after the hives themselves had been retaken and the Orc armies crushed, the Orcs are stubborn creatures. And little things like the complete and utter military annihilation of their larger army doesn't really necessarily bother them all that much as they go to ground deep beneath the hive cities. And hive cities are inhospitable environments at the best of times. There is a reason why most underhives are enormous lawless slums, where anything and everything goes, and even the Arbites only venture when they are in need of a little bit of heavy weapons fire practice on whatever lives down there. It is down there. Underhives tends to be collapsing, smouldering heaps of garbage, rubbish, radiation, and toxins. Not a fit environment for proper Imperial Guard regiments, but a perfect environment for the Chem-Dogs. In fact, the Warrenous subterranean environment reminded them a bit of a better version of home. They could even breathe the air down here. It smelled bad, sure, but it wouldn't kill a man stone cold dead in 5 seconds of exposure. A tremendous improvement as far as they were concerned. And many of the tricks and tools of the trade they had learned on Savlar worked just fine in the underhives as well. There was never any shortage of high explosives, grenades of both frags and crack varieties, as well with weaponry, flamethrowers and heavy bolters, because, well, the Armageddon Steel Legion was well equipped with all of these things, and thus, in turn, the Chem-Dogs were well equipped with all of these things. And better yet, there is another reason as well why underhives are usually such hives of scum and villainy and many adventurous individuals. It is because a lot of really cool shit can be buried down in the underhives. There can be full-on treasure troves of forgotten information, of data, and archaeotech down there. Entire caches of nigh on immeasurable wealth that the hundreds, if not thousands, of local gangs spend much of their time fighting over. But, well, here's the thing. gang wars in the Underhive are ferocious affairs, no doubt about it. It has all kinds of murder, torture, mutilation, and mini-genocides. It has the storming of ramshackable fortresses. It has the construction of various improvised weaponry. It has terror bombings. It has all kinds of dreadful shit happening. But, well, see, it's all kind of rather small scale. And when an entire Imperial Guard regiment moves in, with all of the arms and armor they've looted from the Armageddon Steel Legion, the scale of conflict changes quite drastically and quite quickly. It puts me in mind of a movie, Gangs of New York, I think it was called, which tells you the story about two rivaling gangs, and they do all kinds of horrible shit to one another, and in the movie's climax, the two gangs square off, and they're carrying like little weapons, like meat cleavers and knives, and, you know, those little fisty stabbing thingy-bobs and shit, and they look all kinds of creepy, like, we're gonna fight now, and they charge against each other, and it's all slow motion and dramatic. And then a fucking cruiser, an armored cruiser sitting at port, begins bombarding them with its main guns, annihilating both gangs in seconds as the US Marines move in to gun down the few scattered shell-shocked survivors. That is very much so how I imagine the arrival of the Chem-Dogs in an Underhive would be working out. And in the case of the Chem-Dogs on Armageddon, they got away with all manners of wonderful treasures from the Underhive, none of which were ever reported to the authorities of the planet, mind you, because, well, again, remember, the Chem-Dogs have the right to plunder whatever they come across. And all of this, in turn, has led to a handful of regiments that have had enough luck on their side, enough ingenuity, enough of a go-getter attitude, and enough of an ability to borrow to actually turn into really rather frightening war machines, like the 71st Regiment, for example, which are famous for including a Lehman Russ executioner in their ranks, with a plasma destroyer cannon. Hell, the fact that a Savlar Chem-Dog regiment has an armoured brigade to begin with is rather impressive, and seems to indicate that there's another regiment out there somewhere still looking for the tanks they misplaced a few campaigns back. And speaking of campaigns, so we should talk a bit how the Savlar Chem-Dogs fight, at least in theory, and this is going to be a rather broad topic right here, because, well, the Savlar Chem-Dogs have no real battle doctrine, not beyond that applied to most penal legions, which is the commissar and the officers stand well back of the front line and then order the men to advance. After shooting a few of the more hesitant elements, they then wait and have some afternoon tea, and if somebody comes back, then they wait to fire, until they're told whether or not the people returning are actually retreating, in which case you give the order for the machine gun teams to begin firing, or if they're simply coming back to report that they've taken the enemy positions, in which case you hold fire for the time being. But in the case of the Savlar Chem-Dogs, well, they're a little bit more of a rabid dog is perhaps how I'd describe them. Your average penal legion is a blunt instrument. It is something that is thrown at the enemy and used and abused until there's nothing left. Then you ship the regimental number back to wherever they came from, and then you raise another regiment. Now, undoubtedly, there are more than a fair few Chem-Dog regiments that have run into that exact same fate as well, but ideally, they would be deployed more in the manner of the 14th Regiment, where their particular skills can be made best use of, deploying them into extremely toxic environments, or areas that other regiments simply don't want to go, or, in the case of an Underhive, don't really have any hope of ever clearing out properly. there are simply too many places for an orc to hide in that a random recruit from a forest world, for example, would never even think of checking, that the Chem-Dogs could sniff out quite easily. These environments, broken environments, also benefit their, independent spirit? Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Because the Chem-Dogs work best when they are simply let loose into an environment to fight like, well, criminal scum rather than an army. When they were fighting in the Underhive of Armageddon, there were relatively few running gun battles. The Chem-Dogs would only engage in that when they were sure that they could win, and they had an overwhelming advantage in terms of firepower or numbers or positioning. Otherwise, they'd plant traps, they'd lay ambushes, they'd undermine entire hive stacks with explosives and wait for the orcs to wander into it, not really caring if anybody else triggered the traps either, creating enormous and highly dangerous killing grounds around their camps and little bases, from which they would then venture out primarily to raid and loot. But if they ran into some orcs along the way, well, gravy. They've got weapons and ammunition too that can be sold on the black market. Not to mention, I'm sure they did a brisk trade in trophies as well. Orc tooths or skulls for spoiled spire highborns, for example, or authentic orc weaponry, which in many cases resembles scrap metal simply hammered into a vaguely sword-like shape, which, to be fair, is not all that much different from actual orc weaponry. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, the Chem-Dogs are a criminal gang of delinquent psychopaths and murderers. And so the best way to use them is to place them somewhere, forget about them, and then, when you're done, hope that you can call them to heel. Which, most of the time, again, you probably can, because they are very, 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 very good at the whole looting thing, so if you leave them there for a year or two, odds are they are going to be more than eager to move on to an area with flusher opportunities for salvage. In theory, this also means that a regiment that manages to stay combat effective for a long period of time might actually turn into a halfway decent formation. It still can't be trusted, and you still don't want to deploy it alongside actual troops, but they might be able to take on more ambitious projects. Eventually, if they do too well for themselves, they might be asked to, assault mainline enemy fortifications instead, because, well, you've got all of those armored brigades. Might as well put them to good use. But such is life in the Imperial Guard. Even for a non-standard regiment like the Chem-Dogs, the final end of the road for most guardsmen is a glorious, or inglorious, more often than not, death in the service of the God Emperor. And maybe, just maybe, that'll be a redemption enough. At least for some of them. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.